Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Harding to the Talent Equation podcast. Jonathan, welcome.
Sure, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, fantastic! We reached out. I reached out to you on Twitter to connect because I've read your book, which is fantastic, which is called Mensch, Beyond the Cones. And obviously, as soon as I saw the subtitle being Beyond the Cones, I was immediately hooked in, and I got into the book, and it was all about coaching in Germany, and really, really interesting. But before we jump into the book, because there's so much to get into there, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just kind of telling the audience a little bit about you and your journey in football, and also in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a freelance sports journalist who specialises in German football. I've been covering German football ever since I left university. I studied German at university. I've spent a lot of time in Germany and German-speaking countries throughout my life. So the language has always been something that's been very close to me, which is part of the reason why the chapters are named the way that they are with German words. I was very fortunate to have that connection with language from an early age because I think it left such a big impact, or made such a big impact on me as an individual. And yeah, once I finished university, I got an internship in Munich. I worked down there doing some translation work for Bundesliga clubs, doing some social media work down there. And then around the 2014 World Cup, just beforehand, I got an opportunity to do some freelancing for Germany's international broadcaster, which is DW, which made me move up a little bit further north towards Cologne, and that's where I'm based now. And I do a lot of freelance work. I've done some work for publications in the UK as well, FourFourTwo and the likes. But yeah, my focus has always been on German football. And about 3 years ago, I took it upon myself to write this book, and I wanted to shed a bit more light on coaches and on human beings, because I felt like football was neglecting that aspect and not talking about humans enough. And yeah, here I am today, fortunate enough to speak to you about it. So thank you.
Well, the fascinating thing from my perspective was, and the first question I was going to ask you really was, what made you write a book about coaching and coaches? Because it's not as if, ordinarily most books in football are written usually about footballers, or if they are written about coaches, it's usually from the perspective of the coach as, in a particular role, for example, in a club, and their success stories, and it's usually that kind of behind the scenes thing. But you've gone broader than that. You've looked at, coaching full stop in general, as well as aspects of coach development, how coaches are learning, and all those sorts of things, which is obviously absolutely fascinating from my perspective. But I was assuming that I might be like an audience of one, and so I just was wondering what made you go in that direction.
No, I think it was just, I felt like there wasn't enough conversation around the coach. You're right to point out that a lot of football publications and media are focused on players themselves, but ultimately we don't talk about coaches very often outside of the win or loss column, or the hired or fired column. And I think there's a lot of ground there that needs to be covered, because ultimately these are the individuals that are in charge of these players and these people, these persons' development. You can't escape that. And I think we need to have a little bit more time and focus and appreciation for the work that these coaches put in, whether that's a head coach or members of a coaching staff. I felt there was a need to do that. I felt from a German perspective, I read Living on the Volcano by Michael Calvin, and I thought it was such a great book and an insight into the struggles of coaches in the UK. And I thought, it's strange, Germany won the World Cup in 2014. A lot of people look at Germany as having sort of the blueprint for coaching in many regards and for football generally. And yet nobody's really talking about that. So it was the combination of those two things that sort of kicked me into action, if you like. And then, it took me a long time to travel around the UK and Germany to get the stories, I suppose, but also just to speak to the people that knew more than I did, and I was able to share those stories and to shed some light on how many things a coach must consider when it comes to doing their job. And I don't just mean, setting up a team for Saturday. I mean, approaching being hired, being fired, how to handle training, how to handling the media. There's just so many things that a coach needs to deal with. And I didn't feel like enough time was spent considering that or talking about them.
And I think that's one of the brilliant things for me is it really does shed a light on that. And I think that's missing, in my opinion, in a lot of narratives about coaching. It's sort of assumed that first and foremost it's about kind of buying the best players, and then almost everything else sort of takes care of itself. But and I know that's not necessarily true, because people do, I think, generally understand that the coach, plays an important role. However, I don't think people have fully understood what goes into the development of a really high quality coach, and also the scale and complexity of the role, particularly nowadays.
Correct. Absolutely. And, having the opportunity to understand and listen to people go into the details of that complexity was kind of mind blowing. Even as a journalist who's been in and around football for quite a few years, you don't always get that greater understanding. Football clubs can be quite closed off about that, and I can understand why. But having the opportunity to speak to some people who are open and willing to tell me about the complexity of some of those things, it really does make you think and reassess, because if you consider that, then the way that you view a game on Saturday completely changes. And I think then your assessment of coaching would have to change. Actually, I think a lot of coaches need to take that into consideration. I mean, obviously, I'm not a coach. I'm not here sitting here telling coaches what to do. But from the experiences that I had writing this book, and from what the coaches who I spoke to told me, it certainly seems to be a case of there needs to be a greater sense of, I'm not going to assess or evaluate my week based on the result on Saturday, because ultimately, I could have had a great week and we would have lost on Saturday, and everything is now rubbish because we lost on Saturday. Well, no, that's completely wrong. We may have had a terrible week and won on Saturday, and everyone's patting me on the back. So, the way that you assess that as a coach needs to change. But I think also, as you say, and you're right to point this out, we on the outside, whether we're fans or journalists or whoever, we also need to consider that those two things are very different.
Now, just as a starting point, actually, you call the book Mensch, and that I think it's literally page one. You explain why it's called Mensch and what that's an abbreviated reference to. I was going to try. I did GCSE German, right? So I was going to try and go, kind of what Mensch stands for, or what it's an abbreviation. So I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go Menschenfänger. Is that anywhere near close?
Menschenfänger. Yeah, not bad. Very
okay.
Good. There you go. Very good.
So just explain a bit about what that means, and then what that reference, because that really captured me. That description of, or that way of capturing a coach's role, I think is quite different from, how some people would perceive a coach, but certainly coaching in Germany, which has probably an unfair reputation in a particular way. But yeah, explain that a bit more for me.
Well, Mensch in itself is the German word for human, or person. But it's also a word that can be used in German when you're aggravated. You would say, "Oh, Mensch,"
okay.
Sort of frustrated, in a way that in English we would say, "Oh man, come on," So it's actually funny that it has that level. And in Yiddish, it actually means a good person, a person of high standing quality, sort of thing. So there are so many levels to the word, but it actually works so well on its own. And obviously this book is really about getting to the essence of what it is to be a coach based on human values. So that's why the word worked so well for me. And Menschenfänger is someone who, you believe in and that you would run through walls for, and that's really at the core extension of Mensch. It's something that I think is such a valuable trait for coaches to have. Jurgen Klopp is the obvious example for that. People who you hear about, players who play in his teams, are always willing to say that they would run through walls for him. It doesn't have to be that way. There are many ways for a coach to motivate you as a player. But listening to people doing the research for this book, listening to people tell me about those traits, it was really obvious to me that you cannot, I mean, in some cases, I think you can't help it, but I think in most cases, you cannot be successful as a head coach unless you are someone who is able to captivate a room. And I mean that as a collective, but also in the sense, I understand the individual needs of every single member of this 25-man squad, but I am also able to bring those individual needs together to form a strong collective. And if those individuals respect and follow you, then you are obviously someone who is worth believing in and running through walls for, proverbially speaking. But that's really what was at the core of it. And that's not a uniquely German trait, but the beauty of the German language is that these words can sometimes have such poetic meaning. I sometimes think that English is missing that in some respects. I mean, take Leidenschaft, which is the first chapter. Leidenschaft is the German word for passion. And yet half of that word, Leiden, is to suffer. That is the verb for to suffer. So actually anyone who's a football fan or a sports fan would obviously agree that if you are passionate about something, aka supporting a team, there is a degree of suffering in that passion. And I think that's the same for coaching, that's the same for playing. So there are some wonderful aspects of the German language that I felt like I couldn't ignore. And that's why they're included in the book. And that's part of the reason why the book is called Mensch.
Well, and that's why I think that was one of the things that really captured me, was actually the beauty and, like you say, almost the poetry of Menschenfänger, because it literally translated, as you point out, it's like, human catcher or people catcher.
Yeah.
And there's something about that, not in a, I mean, I think to some people it might evoke the idea of, some sort of dark, villain that's scooping up people, but that's exactly kind of how I suppose many of the people who've come on the podcast, we I think probably conceive of coaching in this way. It's a way of catching, the essence of another human being and enabling them and supporting them on a journey of development. And that it really grabbed me, that just right from the start, this idea of conceiving of coaching in that way, because I think a lot of people see coaching as quite a technocratic type of pursuit. It's very much about what you do on the pitch, and it's very much about the kind of, it'll be about the analysis stuff. I mean, you do go into the analysis side of things, but it's very much about what I would call the hardware side, very much the on-pitch side or the physical side. Whereas you're really capturing there with that, or I think what's being captured by that word, and a lot of what you're talking about is very much the human piece, which is a story that's not told very well or very often, and is I think a really missing narrative in a lot of the stuff we talk about. Amongst coaches, we'll talk about it all the time, but in the popular narrative, we're not. It's almost as if, that's the pink and fluffy stuff. We really want to get into the hardware because that's really where it is all happening, and I think that's a really nice way, like you say, the poetry of that capturing of what I believe the coaching experience should be like is really nice.
Yeah, it's important that you mention that, because I think it's true that the modern, broader perception of that, it doesn't exist, and we need to do more to re-engage people in that, to make sure that they're aware of that, because I think it's too easy to forget that coaches or players or anyone involved in professional football is a human being. It's too easy to forget that. All of the things that you endure in your life as an individual are not too dissimilar from someone who is on a professional stage in that situation. The only difference is the pressure, expectation, and obviously the finance, but that's affecting them, but they're still enduring some of the same things that you are. You may have a really tough day at work. You may have a really tough week in your life. And yet you have the privacy sometimes to be able to deal with that without everybody focusing on you. And yet as a professional athlete or as a coach, whatever it is, whether you're the player or the coach, if you have the same issues in the same situation, you've got the whole world looking at you. And, there's this feeling of, there's not enough room here for me to be open and honest and to be a human in this situation. Well, that needs to change, I think. To be a good coach, one of the coaches actually said this to me, to be a good coach is to be who I am, or is to be a coach is to be who I am as a human being. And I think some coaches will probably say that that's not how they've approached the profession, but I would argue that the best coaches in the world at the moment are the truest representations of themselves as human beings.
100%. And I think, again, I think that's something that I think, I think I've heard a lot of people get a bit frustrated by amongst, kind of like coaching peers, if you like. For example, you see images of, say, for example, Guardiola, kind of still sort of instructing on the sideline, or still talking to somebody like Raheem Sterling, moments after they've, just won a major trophy, about areas of improvement. And there's this sort of sense that, oh yes, here he is, this great teacher, this person who's, constantly providing instruction and new knowledge. But what they don't realize is the level of connection and the level of the strength of relationship that one must have with a player, like someone like Raheem Sterling, to be able to do that in that moment, and for that person to be an absolutely active recipient, as opposed to someone saying, hang on, coach, let me go and celebrate. We just won a big trophy here. Yeah. And they're missing those kind of key ingredients, and it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't do that if you didn't have that relationship with the player. You wouldn't be able to sit them down, or even, straight after such an intense level of performance, say, that was brilliant, we just won, you've reached the pinnacle, but I want you to work on this, this, and this. And you have to be able to have a relationship between otherwise you wouldn't be able to do that, and as you say, you wouldn't be able to broach someone on that subject. And I was fortunate enough in the work for this book to be able to speak to a lot of people who were able to shed light on that process and the number of challenges that coaches have to face in that situation and the things they have to adapt to. I think one of the things that is so difficult for coaches in the modern era is handling the power shift. I think there's a lot of power now with players, and if they're not getting played or they don't feel comfortable in a situation, then they're able to force a move, or they're able to speak to their agent and try and, navigate or create a situation that works in their favor. I think that affects coaching. I think that affects atmosphere, and I think that affects relationships. I think that makes life far harder for a coach. And it takes a human response, I think, in order to convince a player that perhaps a move to another club for a high amount of money, for a 200% increase in their wages, is not worth it, because maybe there's a human aspect there that doesn't work. And I think that's a conversation that you would need to have. And that's one you can only really have if you have a strong relationship. Countering these forces and the shift in power in football now is one of the reasons that having strong relationships and understanding human values is so important, because otherwise coaches are going to be under even more pressure, and they're going to struggle even more. Because if you can't sit down with a player and say, look, I know that you want to make this move. I know that 40 million is a lot of money. I know you've always wanted to play in that league, but you don't know that culture. You can't speak that language. Is your family going to be happy there? Are you going to be happy here? Give me one more year in this team. We've got something special here. You obviously feel at home. You speak the language here. You'll be more mature. You'll be ready for it. You can have that conversation at any time, but it is probably going to be more effective if you have a relationship with a player who truly understands you and who respects you. So again, without the human values in the game, it's almost impossible, I think, to be successful or to build something. Jurgen Klopp's work at Liverpool, even before he won the Champions League, he had already won for me, in the sense that he had connected with the community again. He had got Liverpool fans talking about and supporting their team like they hadn't done in the last 5-10 years. He got youth players into the first team. He got players that were never, ever looking like they were going to be anything, suddenly believing in themselves and reaching unbelievable levels of confidence. And what he was able to do, I think, is, obviously there were football improvements made and he had the right people in place tactically and analytically, but he was able to connect on a human level, both with the community and the team. And that was the difference. And eventually he won something, which is not a surprise.
And people make a lot about, just talking about Klopp, people make a lot about, kind of, for example, his sideline antics, so to speak.
Yes.
But I just think that's a genuinely honest representation of who he is, again, as a human being. You talk about the passion. He lives and breathes that kind of passionate intensity, and that comes out in a myriad of ways. Sometimes by him, going berserk on the sideline, and sometimes by him, walking around and looking after players in a really nurturing kind of way. You see all aspects very visibly, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes him him, and he's always been charismatic. He's always been someone who's been very open with his approach to coaching. And that's one of the reasons why I think I was keen to have him as the quote of the last chapter, because I think it's important that we don't just focus on the end result, because he's never focused on the end result. I mean, he says at the end, or I put at the end, this quote, "In all departments of life, including your job, if only the best counts and effort doesn't count, then life is shit." And quite honestly, he's right, because you can't only assess victory in the form of points or trophies. And that's what I mean about him already having won. What is a sports team? What is a football team? It is a sports team reflecting the values of a community, theoretically, right? And Jurgen Klopp has managed to reignite those values in that community. And I've spoken to Liverpool fans who say, before he came, I didn't realize how bad a fan I was. And look at what he's done for that community. And then you ask the players. I mean, Virgil van Dijk. I mean, he the way that he talks about Jurgen Klopp, Andy Robertson, the development that he has taken as an individual. These are all just small examples. And that's not to say that all German coaches are like Jurgen Klopp. Obviously not. Or to say that all coaches should approach the same method as Jurgen Klopp, because actually it only works for him because he's so charismatic, and that's how it works for him. There is a way that a quiet coach, Chris Hughton, one of my favorite coaches, was very successful. He is the complete opposite in many ways. Right? There are many ways to be successful, but you have to be true to yourself. And Klopp, what I like about him is, yes, his emotion and the way that he's open and honest about it. But I think he's also recognized that emotion is important. And I think if we were all a little bit more open and honest, then we would be a little bit more sensitive to certain things. And I think it's better to be sensitive than insensitive, because who wants to be insensitive? But I think there's a certain level of emotional control that needs to be applied. And I think Klopp will be the first to say that there were some situations, particularly when he was Dortmund coach, when it might have been best if he was able to control his emotions. I mean, this isn't football, but Roger Federer, I think, only ever became the greatest tennis player, or one of the greatest tennis players of all time, because he was able to control his emotions. Yeah. When he first started out, he was an extremely emotional player. Those are important moments. And it's not to say that those emotions are not of any value. As you say, it's important that people are who they are and that they're honest to themselves. But there does need to be a certain element of control and recognizing that. And that's also that's part of character development. That's part of learning. It's part of growing. And that's part of growing as a human being. I mean, that's another question for itself. One of the things talking to the coaches in this book, I don't know whether enough of that is being done in the professional game for coaches and for players. There's certainly enough player development, but is there room there for character development? I think so.
Well, interestingly, I was talking to somebody, who was I talking to? Somebody else on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, actually, where they were talking about how in many of the major NFL franchises, Patriots particularly, character development, they actually have character coaches in specific roles. And so for me, I think that is an area that, I mean, I think it used to be filled by the, in inverted commas, let's call it the sports psychologist. Well, the greatest coaches are sports psychologists. They might not have the badge or the official title of sports psychologist, but they absolutely are, because they can tap into human motivation in a way that a sports psychologist, in my opinion, unless they're really embedded within the team, really struggle to do. And I mean, there have been examples of people who perform the role of sports psychologist. The best example I can think of is someone like Gilbert Enoka. So Gilbert Enoka within the All Blacks, he wasn't necessarily there officially as a sports psychologist. I can't even remember what his title was. However, he was almost like the glue, because what he did was he forged a connection between the players and the coaching staff, and he was always able to tap into the sort of the what was going on within the squad, and then help the coaches to ensure that they can connect most effectively with the group as well. So he was almost like I call him like a coach whisperer. And it's a unique role that isn't often used. And I think these roles in the NFL are similar in the sense that they're partly there for the players, but they're not there for the players in isolation of the coaches. They're there to act as a support for the coaches, to help the coaches to develop the players as well.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of a unique role that doesn't sort of exist, but I can see a lot more of that kind of role emerging within, kind of sports franchises as we go forward.
And I think it's important that does happen. I don't think we need more coaches, because I think there are enough coaches at the moment. certainly enough coaches who are not being given opportunities. And that's concerning in itself. We don't need more sports psychologists because there are plenty of qualified sports psychologists who are needed at football clubs, who are already in place, who are there to do the things that they are qualified to do.
Yeah.
But the reason I stress that is that what we really need is someone who is there not to talk about the sport. Because actually the problem lies in the ego that comes with coaches who arrive at coaching staffs and they consider themselves to be perhaps a little bit more educated or intelligent than the head coach. And then you have clashes and then it's difficult. You need someone to arrive at the situation and say, look, I am not here to talk about the football. That is your job. I am here to develop the character of these individuals so that they don't get neglected as human beings.
Yeah.
And I think if someone, you're right to point out the NFL, so many teams do that in character development. They call it player development over there, which is a bit confusing because for us, player development would actually just be player development.
Yeah.
But character development is something that is for me, it's a shock that isn't really a consideration in professional football. But like you say, I do think it's going to have to change in the future because you can't expect the head coach to do so many things. I mean, that was one of the things that one of the coaches told me. He thinks that in the future we're going to have a head coach for Saturdays and a head coach for Wednesdays, because you're going to have one who's going to develop the young players and one who's going to get the results on Saturday. Because at the moment, the list of tasks that the head coach is expected to perform is continually growing. And to expect one man or one woman to do that is absolutely outrageous. Of course, they have a staff to help them, but ultimately, no one ever talks about the staff. Everybody only ever talks about the head coach, and they're the ones who are always, the first to go when the problem arises. So
I definitely think that's an area that's overlooked, is the role of a head coach. So I think traditionally, certainly say in England, I think the idea of the manager, so to speak, which is would be called a head coach in any other part of the world. But the manager is seen as sort of, the all-knowing oracle who, transfers go through them and this.
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
They do all that. Well, those days are over, I think, like you say. Yeah. The head coach now, in my view, it has to be kind of a master delegator and a master manager, because you're having to, a lot of the work that happens in elite sport now through UK sport is about actually helping coaches to understand managing multidisciplinary teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nutrition, psychology, physiotherapy, physical development, strength and conditioning, all of those things have to work together to support the development of the athlete. And I think a lot of coaches sort of go, oh, well, that's just their job. They can fix them or they can develop them, and then you just deliver me the best athlete possible and I'll take it from there. It's got to be much more integrated than that, because otherwise you find that the gears grind against each other and it doesn't quite work. Yeah,
definitely. And you need that unison. Otherwise you're going to end up with, more division and that's the last thing you need in a club environment, in an environment that's supposed to be tight-knit, is division. And if you don't create that unity, then it's actually harder to achieve goals because you're all pulling on the same rope but in completely different directions.
So one area I just wanted to just pick up on, firstly, just to sort of circle back to this starting point here, that was a surprise for me, I have to say, and it just probably flags up stereotypes and prejudice. I spent quite a bit of time. I used to work in golf, and I spent a bit of time working over in Germany. And one of the things that I was quite fascinated by, just some cultural differences. So, for example, if you play on a standard sort of golf day and you have a nearest the pin competition in the UK, you get a flag, you stick it in, and you write your name on it, and everything's good. But if you do the same in Germany, there's a tape measure, because they want to know not just who won, but how far away they were.
Yeah.
In meters and centimeters, you know?
Absolutely, yeah.
And for me, I sort of took that as a little bit of, that's an interesting piece of German culture, and there's a famous story about, Bernard Langer, who recently won the senior British Open at the ripe old age of, I think he's either 59 or 69, and for the fourth time, no less. There's a famous story about him and his caddy once asking their partners what was the yardage from this sprinkle ahead. And the opposing caddy said, oh, it's 189. And apparently Langer's caddy and Langer in unison said, is that from the front of the sprinkle ahead or from the back? Now, okay, so these are all stereotypical stories about, kind of how exacting, Germans can be and how precise they want to be, and, engineering and all that sort of stuff. So my assumption was that this book was going to be really technocratic in nature, but it's not. And so I was quite surprised by that. I just was interested in your reflections on that yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived in Germany for quite a while, and German people are always interesting to assess, especially from a foreign perspective. Although I no longer really consider myself foreign because I've been here for so long. But there is certainly an obsession. It's hard to make wide statements about society in general, but especially from my experience in football. I mean, Frank talks about it. Frank Volmuth used to be the head coach of all the coaches at the DFB. He talks about it at the end, and he says, I think of chapter 2, he said, I think we're a bit too obsessed in Germany with this, driving forward. We need a little bit more of the French laissez-faire. And I think there is certainly a degree of that. I certainly feel like this expectation sometimes in Germany is too harsh. Yeah. And I think that's not unfair to say. It's a difficult one. You've got to bear in mind that in Germany, you can study largely for free or for not very much money for a long time. You can get a master's or a PhD. A lot of young people study until their early or mid-30s. So it does generate a different kind of environment to a society in which young people are straight into the workplace. And if people don't want to study, there are opportunities for them to take up a trade or a profession. So they are certainly catered for. I don't know whether Germans as a whole, it's difficult. I certainly have experience living in the country of meeting people who, on the whole, I would say more often than not, are more interested in being extremely accurate. Yes, who would live up to that stereotype of, well, it's 185.3 centimeters, not just nearly 2. Stuff like that I have experienced. And I guess in football, the reflection is that there is sometimes an obsession with the theory. And the concern is that the practice is sometimes different. I mean, Frank Volmuth does talk about that when he was coaching Nagelsmann at the coaching academy, when he was getting his top license, his Fußballlehrer, which is, the top license. He did talk about how Nagelsmann sometimes, when he was first starting out, would have really good ideas from the theory, but would sometimes struggle to recognize that they had to be applied differently in practice. Because obviously you're dealing with human beings, and the numbers and the movements on the paper are not always going to be the same. And you have to consider factors that you will not have been able to consider when you were considering them in theory. So I think that there is an element of that. Obviously, there was some criticism in recent years about Germany creating this generation of laptop coaches, coaches that were only ever focused on the numbers or the analysis. And I don't think that's necessarily fair based on my experience of talking to the people who are involved in coaching the coaches at the top level. It certainly seems like a lot is being done to develop the soft skills in coaches so that they understand how to be in a boardroom, how to deal with an interview, how to deal with players. There certainly seems to be a lot that's being done to develop that human aspect. The question is, of course, whether that translates. I think it does, and I think that's reflected in the fact that there are a number of German coaches now coaching in England. You look at the respect that was given to the work being done by people like Daniel Farke or Daniel Stendel, who were working at youth level in Germany and now have first team jobs in the UK. And not just that, but have done great work. Daniel Farke getting Norwich promoted is unbelievable, and he did it his way. Daniel Stendel did great work with Barnsley to get them promoted to the Championship. And I think that's because youth football in Germany is of a higher level, and it's certainly recognised and it's respected. And I don't think there's too much of a difference between coaching in the first team and the second team here compared to the UK. But I also think, as I say, the recognition and respect is different. So if you do 300 games or 200 games at youth level here, there is a certain level that you have an extreme amount of experience as a coach. It's not just disregarded. Oh, you've never coached first team. You've never, there is a certain level of consideration. And I, from afar, obviously I haven't lived in the UK for a while, I certainly don't feel that is a consideration that is given in the UK. Oh, you coached at youth level where you've not really done it with the big boys. So I think there's a certain distance there, and there's a difference that I think is a little bit concerning. Just in my experience of speaking to these coaches, that was something that really stood out. And in terms of, whether Germans are anal about certain specifications or not, I think the way in which football has developed in this country in recent years, there's been a strong focus on tactics.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of players now are capable of playing in so many different formations. But that is also the reason that players like Jadon Sancho have come to Germany, because those are the exact players that are missing from Germany. Because the downside of focusing so much on tactics is that you remove individualism from your coaching, and that is problematic. So it's not a perfect approach, but I do think that, you know, there are considerations there for the human as well.
I think, yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek when I was talking about German culture, but I suppose I think that where I was driving at was my expectation in terms of, because you tell the story through the eyes of the people that you've spoken to, you know, so one of the things I think is great about the book, actually, and you mentioned this before, you know, because you don't necessarily have a coaching background yourself, you've been very true, I think, to what they've said and what they've represented. And I mean, if I'd have written it, I'd have obviously had a bias and a lens, you know, and that would have come through loud and clear. Whereas you've been very true to that. But you see, what was interesting was just, you know, kind of, you're speaking for them, if you like, you're interpreting whatever they're saying or reporting what they're saying. And what was coming out to me, the messages that were coming out, were different from the ones that I expected. Now, there are a few areas, though, that I think are really, really interesting. One of the areas I do want to get into is what's happening with, you mentioned youth, you know, the youth development, what's happening with youth competition, which I'll come back to, because it's definitely a really interesting thing, because I think it would surprise some people as well. But just talking about just a couple of things there. So firstly, you mentioned, and it's in one of the early chapters, how the German sort of coaching system has been set up, with their top coaching badge being the Fußballlehrer. You know, it's a football teacher, isn't it? It's the translation. And the way that's structured, and the level of expectation in terms of learning, and how, and the amount of time it takes in purely, you know, kind of learning hours, if you like, 800 hours. And I'm thinking to myself, and you even make reference to the equivalencies, say, in the UK in terms of the number of hours. And that's not to decry either. But no. What I'm trying to say is that the expectation in terms of to achieve an elite standard or an elite standing amongst your coaching peers requires a genuine dedication and commitment to learning and your sort of craft. You know, it's a full-on, you know, almost like it's a PhD in coaching, I would say, or at the very least, it's a master's degree in coaching. Now, over here with work that would, you know, I've been working in coach development, coach education for quite a long time, and under the UK coaching certificate, the aspiration was that, you know, the highest level would be a level 4, and that should be the equivalent of a postgraduate qualification, a master's level qualification. Well, my experience certainly of some of those level 4s, they've been pretty good, but there was no way I would consider them to be postgraduate level qualification. This is a different level of expectation around commitment to ongoing learning and education. And the way it's structured, actually, interestingly enough, it's probably less structured than I assumed it would be. It's obviously structured, but it's got far more flex within it to enable different coaches who are in different pathways and journeys, I suppose, to be able to progress within it. It was a really, really interesting insight to the thinking behind what it takes. And I think this definitely lends to, I think, some of Germany's cultural heritage around how much they value education. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough to say. The value of education and the value of qualification is extremely high in this country. Yeah. I think a lot of people I know have a minimum of a master's.
Right.
And that is already a board that, you know, a standard that is incredibly intimidating in some respects. But, you know, there are a number of factors that need to be considered. A lot of people in the UK don't have a master's because they can't afford it. You know, that's also something that has to be considered. That's the advantage of having free higher education in this country. But yes, there is a desire to be extremely well qualified, and that is something that is then reflected in football in Germany as well. And I asked Frank about that, and I said, you know, I write about this in the book. I said, 800 hours is a phenomenal amount of time to be spending, you know, compared to other countries. And he said, look, UEFA sets the minimum. and some countries can only reach that minimum based on finance or facilities, and that's fine, and that's different for every country. I said, but why do you guys set it so high? I said, hey, we're Germany. If we're going to do something, we'll do it right.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely the epitome of the point. He wants, and they want, to create a coach who has every single opportunity explored and who comes out of the experience fully qualified to be able to tackle as much as they can, because they also recognize that it's not possible for them to know everything, to tackle everything that they can in a professional football setting at the moment that they get the chance to coach a first team or even coach in the youth team. I mean, one of the things that really blew my mind was that they practice interview scenarios and they practice how to handle a team in certain situations. I mean, one of the coaches that went through this course ended up doing well in an interview situation in real life because he had prepped and they had done the role play of sitting down and interviewing for the job. And you have to practice and understand the ethos and the mantra of the club that you are applying for and convince them that you are the right coach to carry that club forward based on their philosophy. Now, that was something that really interested me. That means that is being practiced. That's a brilliant skill to practice, because if you think about that, that's something that's not linear in terms of education. It's not just, let's learn how to do 4-4-2. That's learning how to understand how to be in an interview situation and how to reflect a club's philosophies. Or there was another situation where, for example, okay, it's February, lads. Let's pretend that you're going to take over Schalke now. How would you finish out the season? What changes would you make? You're putting coaches in realistic situations, even if they're role play situations, for their potential careers when it comes around. So they are in many ways prepared for situations that come around in the future. Obviously, a lot of the theory is something that you can only know whether it works when you put it into practice on the training field. And I'm sure most coaches will say, yeah, you can read all the books you want, you can watch all the film that you want, but it doesn't really, you don't really get a feel for it until you're actually out on the field with the players themselves, and you can get a grip with the training session itself. But yeah, the level of detail, I think, is a reflection of the way in which work is done. It's done fully, it's done properly, it's done to the absolute highest level. And there's certainly, there are obvious positives to that, but the negative is, as Frank said, that sometimes that can create a slightly damaging culture of, well, we've got to be the best, we've got to do more, you've got to do more, you've got to do more. And, one of the issues is that if you don't create room for the human to make mistakes and to learn and to grow, then, that can be troubling. I think what Frank was saying on the course that they do well with is that there's room for them to make mistakes, but they have to recognize every decision that they make has a positive and negative impact. And what Frank was really good at telling me was that he was saying, I don't walk in there and say, this is wrong and this is right. I give you the option, and if you say to me, how did I handle that situation? Well, you kind of just spoke to one player when you had everyone listening. Should I bring the group together? Well, if you bring the group together, then you'll break up the training session and you'll lose the rhythm. So you give them both sides, and they have to decide for themselves, which I think is a much better way of learning than just saying, well, do this or do that, because you ultimately put the onus on the coach. So, the level of detail, it didn't necessarily surprise me because, as I say, I've been fortunate enough to live here for a while, and that's certainly something that I've seen reflected in my job, in the way that people approach in many professions. But it is a testament to the level of graft, as you said, that they put into the job.
And it really that was also of real interest to me, was how much. Yes, obviously there's a significant theoretical component, but there's also the application side of this as well, and a big part of it is the actual, kind of almost like semi-real or real scenarios where the coaches are kind of given almost like real-time feedback based on how they've acted in certain ways. And
yes.
Again, this is something that I'm working on here. Really, is I think a lot of coach education across different sports has been very much focused on kind of you learn the knowledge, but you don't necessarily learn the application. And so for me, I think the application bit is as important, if not more. Well, it's more important really than the knowledge. It's no good knowing stuff if you can't actually apply it.
Definitely.
And so that almost that procedural knowledge element really being a big part of the way this works, and that's just almost like invaluable. And I feel like novice coaches need more of that, because they're the ones at the coalface with the kids making all the mistakes with all the parents and all the different.
Yeah.
So it feels to me like saving it for this elite few is fine, but I think it's one of the things I think the FA's done brilliantly on, actually, in fairness, is they've actually put this army of mentors out there working at the grassroots, helping coaches with real life problems. And it's unheard of, unseen, difficult work, evenings, weekends, Sundays, all that sort of stuff. But for me, I think that's really going to bear fruit in future years, hopefully from the perspective of the quality of coaching, but also in kind of the experiences that the kids have.
And that's one of the things that one of the coaches told me that they thought was really impressive that England had done. But, one of the reasons that England are able to do that is the money.
Sure.
And, Germany are not able to roll out such an internationally spread mentoring system, or not, sorry, international, on a national scale. They can't spread that out because the money isn't there to do that. And I think that's a fortuitous situation that England finds themselves in. And I'm glad that they're putting that money in the right situations to provide that mentorship, because, as you say, the most important thing is making sure that the coaches are being nurtured and helped on the job, rather than just, here you're in the classroom and now you can go out and, practice and good luck with it. You also need to be guided and helped through the situation when you're practicing it for real. I think Germany does a good job of doing the best that they can with that situation, but obviously there's always room for improvement in those areas.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, I totally agree. I think if I was advising the German football authorities on some of their coach development systems, and I'd apply this to kind of any governing body, really, is I think one of the things that's been missing from kind of coach development is that I think coaches learn to be coaches, but they don't learn to support other coaches. So for
Correct.
me, when I became, say, a level 3 coach, there's like a responsibility within the club that you're going to guide and nurture others. But the problem is, that's actually really quite difficult. It's far more difficult than coaching a group of kids. It really is.
Yeah, it really is.
And so actually, I think that should be built into learning as you become a more senior coach, that you're learning to support other coaches, and this almost developing a culture of, kind of calling up or helping the people who are starting through their journey is a culture that we probably need to bring into sport. It's certainly something we're trying to do over here in England.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is probably the greatest challenge for coaches moving forward, because managing your staff is, as you say, is actually probably more taxing, because all the players in your team are looking up to you, and they know that you ultimately hold the key to their future, so that they're already fairly attentive to you, and they're already focused on what you want to do, and they want to play. But the staff, these people are already qualified in their positions, and of course they know that they need to work with you, but they're not as dependent on you as the players in many respects. So handling them is a completely different task in itself. And, one of the reasons that I think Ralf Hasenhüttl is such a good coach, and I do talk about this in the book, is that Helmut Gross, who was one of the coaches that I was able to speak to when he was at Leipzig, who was basically Ralf Rangnick's number one advisor, he told me that one of the reasons that Hasenhüttl was so successful at Leipzig, and why I think he's doing such a good job at Southampton, is that he is brilliant at managing a staff. He is really good at bringing that team together and recognizing, as you say, that actually managing a group of adults is probably more taxing and difficult than it is managing a group of young players. And that is partly, I believe, based on the experience I've had from the people I've spoken to, because egos play a far bigger role in a coaching staff sometimes than they do in a playing squad. And you have to be careful as a head coach to make sure that the focus is on the football. It's not about the coach doing well for himself, or the coaches coming out and saying, yeah, we had a terrible season, but you know what? I did a good job. And that's a problematic environment if you let that fester, or you let that create, or you end up with those people, and as a head coach, you need to be strong enough to create that kind of environment that's positive going forward. But it is a big challenge. And that's why I said earlier that I think in the future, you're going to the size of staff is only going to grow, in my opinion, because I think the needs of players and of coaches themselves will only continue to grow, and you need more people around to provide levels of support. And that's going to make that job all the more challenging. You've got to really be good at micromanaging people.
I'm glad that you brought up Southampton, actually, because I was really fortunate to be invited to do some work with the Southampton Academy. It's a really extensive network of coaches. And I mean, one of the things that really impressed me was, I mean, that is a dedicated group of individuals who are really committed to, kind of improving. And I mean, Southampton, I suppose, perhaps is probably better known for its production of players, perhaps, than it is for its, kind of exploits on the field, so to speak. And when I was there, we spent some time in the kind of what you call the academy canteen. I mean, calling it a canteen probably is it's not quite the right way to describe it, because it's better than most restaurants I've been in. But on the wall was all of the names of kind of what you might call Southampton graduates from their academy. Some had gone on to other clubs, etc., and some stellar names. And I said to this group, because we were talking about all different things, and I said to them, "That's your trophy cabinet right there." And what was interesting was, I think they didn't perhaps look at it that way, because, I said, "You guys, this is it. Look at that. I mean, I'm not sure there's many other academies out there who could probably do that. These are the players that's been produced by this academy, who have all gone on to have professional contracts or whatever it might be." So in terms of the way they measure themselves, I mean, and it was at a time just before, in fact, I think, so when I went in there, I think Hasenhüttl has just been appointed maybe a week before. So there was a changing of the guard, so to speak. And clearly the academy itself was, I think it felt to me anyway, that there'd been a period of them really feeling quite undervalued and being just somewhere else. I mean, to the point where they couldn't walk in certain areas. They couldn't walk through certain areas where either players or coaches might be. They had to go, the academy staff had to go a different route to.
Weird.
Yeah, I know, very odd. It felt really strange. Anyway, but I mean, and I could sort of tell, and nobody was saying anything, but I could sort of tell it wasn't particularly popular. I'm pretty certain that won't be the case. But I heard their academy manager say, almost one of the first things that Ralph said to the group, and he said he wants to be called Ralph first and foremost.
Nice.
Ralph said to the group, he says, my focus is on you guys, right? Because you are the future of this club, and bringing the young players through is a key priority of mine. Now, and we've seen it. We've seen young players starting to come into the team, and all of a sudden Southampton's performances are improved. Now, the fantastic thing about this for me, and I think Southampton lost sight of this, in my view, they were one of the few clubs in the Premiership who had a particular playing philosophy and a particular philosophy about player development, and they hired head coaches aligned to that philosophy.
Yes,
I think they lost sight of that in an attempt to kind
stay
of
in the league.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I think they've come back to that with the appointment of Ralph, who I'm now going to just call Ralph from now on, because he, I think, epitomizes some of that philosophy, that idea about player development, and I was really pleased to read that in the book, actually, because I think a lot of people maybe wouldn't see that. But he genuinely has what I call, almost that kind of that fairy dust, if you like. He connects with people. He'd immediately made an impression on this academy. I could almost physically feel the difference in this group. They felt enthused, motivated, excited by their roles again, opportunities to create and innovate. It was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was really happy when Hasenhüttl got the opportunity, because I always thought that he was a coach that was destined for more. I mean, when he was at Leipzig, there were even rumours that he was going to go to Bayern. Obviously, he used to play for the second team there, and I thought he might be the right kind of guy to deal with that, because he was so focused on the individual. But I'm actually glad he ended up where he ended up, because it's an opportunity for him to really get back to focusing on the coaching side of the job. And I think at bigger clubs like Leipzig or Bayern, there's a lot of noise and a lot of expectation around being a head coach or being a manager that you don't get when you coach a team like Southampton. And I mean that with no disrespect, obviously, but it's just a different type of coaching. I'm not surprised that you felt that was different. I feel like the focus on youth football and the development of players coming through academies in Germany is obvious. It's always been obvious, and I think that's been the case since they made that decision after the horrendous 2000 European Championships, where they decided to make basically nationwide changes to their academy structure and force Bundesliga teams to have academies. And it created a generation that ultimately ended in the 2014 World Cup victory. And that was the plan. And it was part of a long-term vision and development, and young players were brought through. And obviously now it's very interesting to see how Germany is going to move forward and start all over again, basically. But if you do that, then you also generate a culture or a generation of coaches who have coached at that academy level and therefore have probably coached the players that end up playing in the first team with the same coaches later on further down the line. And therefore the expectations are the same.
Yeah.
And what you end up in, and I called this generation Y, because they end up always asking you why you're doing certain exercises rather than just doing them for the sake of doing them. And what you've got at the moment in Germany, at least in my experience, is that you've got a generation of players who are not happy just doing exercises. They need to understand the value of them. They need to understand why they're doing them. And I'm sure that that's the same, or it's increasingly the same in England. I certainly get the feelings in the way that Gareth Southgate was talking during the World Cup last year about the way that English players had certainly started to be more vocal and more interested in training exercises and the purpose of drills. You know, that generates a much healthier environment, because if you generate that, then you put the onus on the player. And it's not just, I'm the coach, I tell you what to do. It's an environment where you can both have a conversation and a discussion. And the player themselves might end up saying, oh, you know what, coach, I think we might, if we change this here and we double up at the front post, I think that might be more effective. And then the coach is in a position, because he's cultivated that relationship, to say, yeah, that's a good idea. You know, and that's a healthier environment to be in than, I think we should do this, and because I'm the coach, I'm going to say so. One of the most interesting things I got told on that reflection was when I was talking to the head of video analysis, who was then the assistant manager at Leverkusen, who's now at Leipzig. And he was saying, look, when I explained to players, you know, I need you to make this run on this exercise, I need you to run to the front post from a corner. You know, players' immediate response, if they're of this generation, will be, well, why? Tell me why. And if you know that he's going to say that, then you don't even need to do that or have that part of the conversation. You can say, look, run to the front post, because you're going to drag a man out of space, and you're going to leave a whole space in the 6-yard area where we're more likely to score, because the man behind you, who's your teammate, is going to be free for a header, and that's why I want you to make the run. Therefore, he doesn't even need to ask you why, because you've already explained it to him. And if he asks you why, then you know that that's the reason you need to give him. Yeah. But if you generate a generation, and that's what Germany has done, or at least up until 2014, 2016, of players who were curious and wanted to know and needed explanation, and then obviously changes coaching and changes the environment. And I think it's much healthier, because it's much more give and take rather than just give.
Well, also for me, I mean, one of the most important things about that as well is, I mean, I think it, by the way, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about Generation Y, and people talk about Generation Y quite a bit. However, I think it's always been the case, in the sense that if you want people to be, you know, kind of motivated by something and genuinely sort of committed to something, this idea that they're just going to do it because you've told them to, and they're just then, you know, compliant to an instruction, is, I think, based on a very old school notion of what coaching was, which was based on a kind of military conception around this idea of almost automaticity and drilling. Now, that was designed back in the day because the theory was, you know, you want soldiers who are going to respond to instructions instantaneously, so that they can carry out orders, etc., etc. But that was based on the idea of, you know, we had very, very little time for, you know, we didn't really have a professional military. Now, in the professional military, they've even done away with that, because they've recognized that you don't want a group of soldiers who only respond to orders, because what happens if the people giving the orders are incapacitated?
Exactly.
Soldiers still have to make decisions under fire, you know, in life and death situations, and they can save each other by doing so. So I think a lot of people have now begun to realise, but I think it's been slow in some sports for sure, that this idea of do this because I said really isn't very good. Secondly, and I think this is an important point around what you were saying about Gareth Southgate as well, is you absolutely want players to be looking at the game in that way, because then you've got active participants who are actually actively solving problems right there in the moment. They have a perspective that you probably can't, so they'll add value to whatever it is that you know, they'll see it in a different way. But also, it then means in a game, they might do something similar because they see something happening minute to minute. Very rarely does even a set piece get delivered exactly how it should be delivered. And so therefore, you want people to be able to make a small adaptation because, oh, this is a better option right here, right now. Yeah. Then you get those little moments where something happens that no one quite expected, but it ends up with a really positive result.
Yeah, and you're right to point out that perspective is unique as a player, because you can't have that as a coach. And one of the dangers is, of course, that former players who end up becoming coaches then think that they already know how that works, and then the way that they partake in giving advice or giving coaching tips is dangerous, because they then only really regurgitate what they learned as a player, and that's not necessarily the most effective way to coach. Excuse me. And if you do that, then you negate the opportunity, or you remove the opportunity to really understand a different perspective, and the player's perspective there is very, very unique. I would say that, yes, I agree that, this is probably, the Generation Y has probably been around longer than we consider it. And just because it's got a label now, I think it's different. But I think a key moment for Germany was certainly the turn of the millennium. And I think a lot of what was going into German football before was these old-fashioned values that, ironically, that England spent a long time building their national team off. Well, if you fight hard enough and you really want it and you're passionate, we'll get through. Right. And I think those values, now people realize that every single changing room in the world has those values hanging on the wall. And that to differentiate yourself from that, you have to do far more than say, come on, lads, show me that you really want it. Where's the passion? There's got to be a lot more in your game plan and your halftime team talk than that. And recognizing that, I think, is one of the reasons that the changes were put in place at the start of the new millennium. And then, ultimately you end up with this generation who are more curious. Obviously, I think since humans have been around, you're more likely to get them to do something if they understand the reasons why they're doing it in the first place. I think in football, there was certainly that environment, as you said, of, I'm the commander, and if I tell you what to do, then you will do it. A bit like a headmaster, old school headmaster, this is the way and these are the rules. And I think the way that that's changed and those rules have been not bent, but they've become more malleable, it is a real positive for football, because, you need different perspectives. You need people to be open. You need fewer egos. And, if you have all of those things, you're more likely to be able to bring a team together and realize something and create something special.
Now that takes me on to something nicely, actually, that I really wanted to touch on as well, which is you've got 2 chapters in the book with the same title, Erfinder. Is that right?
Correct.
Innovator is the translation. Now, one of the areas you talk quite a lot about sort of analysis, but it's coming at analysis from a different perspective, which is the use of analysis as a means by which to evaluate players, but evaluating players in a way that I hadn't heard of before, which was around the idea of, and it speaks to what we've just been talking about kind of players who are active problem solvers. And it speaks to how within Germany, there's the use of this analysis now to look at how players are able to utilize space effectively and get into positions that would be able to create attacking opportunities. I can't quite remember how you describe it, but that can you just talk me through that one a little bit as well? Because that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the best example of that is someone like Naby Keita. I mean, that's the reason that Leipzig signed him, because they recognized that he was able to move and get into spaces that other people couldn't. And that's the reason that they were so amazed that nobody in France had picked him up, because when they looked at the film, they were sort of confused that nobody had turned around and said, well, hold on, guys, this guy is able to drive forward and get into space that no one else is. Why is no one else in France picking up on this midfielder? And yeah, I mean, when you look at the value, obviously you come back to analysis, and there's a difference between too many numbers and getting bogged down in the analysis of a player and the technical side of things. But Leipzig have they're pretty specific, and in these 2 chapters on Erfinder, basically focus on Ralf Rangnick in the first one, who really for all of the criticisms that are out there about him, he was a very important coach in the development and the culture of German coaching and the way that it's moved forward. And in the second one, we talk about Elmar Gross, who's the coach, who's basically his number 2 and who's best advised him. And what you're able to see, hopefully, in the 2 chapters together is the way in which analysis is evolving in Germany. I mean, Hoffenheim are another club that have great analysis. We're supported by SAP. They have great technical utilities there and facilities that are able to enhance their assessment. Obviously, finance plays a big role, and there are some controversial reasons behind Leipzig and Hoffenheim having the abilities and the opportunities that they have. But if you look at players who are able to create and get into space, the way that you play football is really important in your analysis of players. So Leipzig play very high pressing, very, very intense football. And the reason that Leipzig were interested in looking at players like Forsberg or like Yusuf Poulsen or Naby Keita is because they recognized not only that they were good at getting into space, but another thing that they analyzed is their ability to sprint or their ability to surge forward. And they were assessing really minute sections. I mean, with Forsberg, when they were looking at him at Malmo, they were like, wow, he's got some work to do here. And if we could get him to do this and this and this. So they sort of see certain elements of players that they feel they can work on. And then if there's enough there based on the philosophy that the club is pursuing, then they'll obviously do their best to recruit them. But the thing that got me the most wasn't necessarily just the view of space, but it was their ability and their potential. I saw Ralf Rangnick speak at one of the coaching conferences that I was at, and his formula was if you took natural born talent and if you looked at them on a scale of 1 to 10, for example, if you took natural born talent and you added it to acquired skill, so the skill that you developed as a player, and you times it by your mentality, that would give you competence. That would give you your overall ability as a player. And what he was saying was, it makes more sense for me to sign someone like Yusuf Poulsen than it does to sign someone who's already perhaps a more finished product. Because he used this formula when he assessed him. He said, look, when we bought Poulsen, he was a 5 out of 10 for natural born talent. He was a 6 for acquired skills. So again, pretty average. But his mentality was a 10. He was willing to develop. He was so involved in the process. And that means his competence is 110. Now, you do the maths on this and you change it around and your mentality is a 4. Even if your ability and your acquired skill is higher, it's not going to give you as much end product. Now, of course, you have to take this with a pinch of salt. Ralf Rangnick is obviously going to say that his players and the players that he's recruited are great and he's done a great job and their mentality is always wonderful. But I think that the logic of this formula is very applicable for German clubs and just for clubs generally who are looking to match their philosophies with their recruitment, and you have to have extremely specific people in place to come up with plans of analysis. Is this player good at scoring goals? Yes. But is it the right type of goal for us? How do we play football? We cross the ball a lot. He's good in the air. His second touch is good. He's good in the 6-yard box. Let's look at these. Let's analyze this situation. Is he determined? Does he apply that? Does he have the mentality? Is he injury prone? Yeah, and I'm sure that football clubs do this. But the very specific nature of the insight that I was able to see about the way that Leipzig certainly do approach some of their transfers was very intriguing because it's an assessment not just of their ability, but their future, their potential, and their human traits in terms of, determination and character. And I thought that was very telling.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what? I was going to ask you about that because that really, that's one of my folded down pages and with notes on it. So that equation is really interesting. I mean, the reason the talent equation is called the talent equation is because I have a very similar equation of thinking about this idea of talent and talent development, which is I see talent as interestingly, the equation works slightly differently, but I see talent as being ability, whether that's natural ability or acquired ability, and that's very different from different people. But it's ability multiplied by what I call the internal factors, but you could call that mentality.
Yeah.
And that's in brackets, and then that's in turn multiplied by the environments that they're either developed within or the environments that they have had experiences within, and all the other bits and pieces like parents and school and club and all those sorts of areas, and all those things need to be aligned, and all that's done over time. So it spoke to that quite a bit. And what I was really interested in was the way Rangnick he put a huge weighting on the mentality.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I've always said the same thing. So I've always said, right, generally speaking, if you get a young product who's got ability, and the mentality, well, that's like the golden egg, right?
Yeah.
Hoover them up straight away.
Yeah.
The problem is, it's rarely that the two things come together.
Definitely.
Imbalanced. And in general, when we're looking and evaluating talent, we look at the ability bit because it's the bit that's easy to see.
Yeah.
We really look at the mentality side, and yet he's flipped it and he said the mentality bit's more important, and I would agree with that, because it's far harder, I think, to take someone with ability and to then really work on their mentality. It's not impossible, not at all, and if you're a really, really skilled operator, you can do that. However, if I had a choice between two players and one had loads of ability and bit weaker on the mentality, but one had mega mentality and a bit weaker on the ability, I'd go for the mentality one, because with the right mentality, you can kind of help somebody nurture and develop their own abilities, and then the sort of sky's the limit. And so for me, that it sort of spoke to that way of thinking, I think.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think a lot of players, and the same is true of coaches. The same is true of coaches. If 100%. You have the mentality that you can tackle you can take not anything, but you're strong enough and you've got those values in place, that's going to stand you in better stead to succeed than if you suddenly have all of the practice and all of the theory and all of the knowledge in your mind, and mentality, especially now, determination, the ability to endure. I think you can see it across all sports. People who make it to the NFL, the things, the amount of tests and hurdles that many of those athletes have to overcome to even get to a team is phenomenal, and then the number of players who play in America that you have to come all the way down through all of those hoops to be able to have a chance. If you have the mentality, you can bet your bottom dollar that most players who make it in that league have an incredible mentality because of all the adversity they probably had to come through to make it. And I think most coaches would say they would rather have 11 players who have an incredible mentality. I mean, Tedesco, who is unfortunately no longer Schalke's coach, but Dominica Tedesco does talk about that. And I quote him in the book. I say he would rather have a team full of players who were strong mentally than 11 super talented players, because he knows, and as you rightly point out, it's perhaps easier to develop a group of players who are super mentally strong and determined than it is to develop a group of really talented players who, couldn't be too bothered about turning up on time to training.
It's interesting, isn't it, how what I've found that's really interesting and something that's been really interesting to me in working in and around elite sport was how overlooked that is, because I think I call them fool's gold. So those hyper able individuals, but clearly very fragile in terms of, and mentality works on a lot of different ways as well. I mean, a couple of researchers over here have done lots and lots of work around this. They call it the psychological characteristics of developing excellence. Anya McNamara, based over at University of Central Lancashire, and there's been various things written about this. You can talk about grit, you can talk about growth mindset, all these sorts of things. They manifest themselves in lots of different ways. Not only is it performance, but it's also it's sort of the off the pitch side. It's how you choose to live your life, the choices you make day to day. The decisions you make in terms of how you decide to fuel your body, how you decide to rest, how you decide to commit, and it's that the act of being a professional athlete. But what's really interesting to me is how overlooked that is in professional sport, in lots of different professional sports. A good friend of mine he's a performance coach, so he covers aspects about psychology, but he talks about all sorts of aspects. You could call him a life coach if you like. He works with a lot of professional sportsmen, particularly quite a few professional footballers, and he's worked with Joe Hart in the past. And Joe Hart, this is not giving away any secrets. Joe Hart's been public about this. He says the football's the easy bit. It's the other stuff. It's all the other stuff that you have to do. It's the training, it's the dealing with the coaches, it's getting the most out of the coaches. And the simple story, is often the player comes in, the coach comes in, and they don't quite gel, and then the performance of the player goes down. Yeah. And it's about the player it's as much about the player having the tools to be able to engage the coach as it is about the coach having the tools to be able to engage the player. Now, ideally, it needs to work both ways, because really a coach is there to get performance out of the athlete. But at the same time, I think it's for the athlete to also understand that they need to think about the way they can best engage. And if they don't engage with that individual, then needless to say, that's going to create a tension that, so it's quite an interesting insight as to how that mentality piece is so often overlooked.
Yeah, and I find it hard to believe as well that, somehow we don't consider determination or the basically the way that individuals live their life as a human being. We don't consider that to be as much value of, they were at an academy for this long. And, actually, I think we need to put a little bit more weight and take a little bit more time to recognize what has happened in this person's life and how have they got to this point, particularly from a player's perspective, and I think that's something that in the professional game really does need to be addressed, because you're talking about players who potentially, by the time that they make their first team debut, maybe they're 19, 20, they've been in academies for 10 years, maybe 8 years. I mean, that is a brutal life. And it's really difficult. And you've got to have someone in place who preferably during the entire process, helps them regain some level of normality in their growing up as an adult, basically. Or when they reach that stage, that is able to keep their feet on the ground, because, as you say, the football is the part that they enjoy the most. It's probably the bit that comes easy, but everything else, they need someone there to help them. And, that doesn't necessarily need to be an agent. It doesn't necessarily need to be someone who has already got an interest or a different agenda. It needs to be someone who is genuinely interested in helping the individual be the best version of themselves. And that, I think, is something that football clubs could do better with, but that is something that they will have to make a change in the future.
So I'm mindful, as much as I'd love to keep drilling into that conversation, because I have an area of personal interest. I do want to just segue back to something I mentioned earlier, which was about the changes that are being made around youth football in Germany, and
yes,
kind of really interesting how, again, I think this is really quite exciting and also quite interesting, how driven by research, driven by a university, making studies of the experiences, etc., and how that's now brought about some fairly wide-ranging changes, which have been almost totally accepted by the German football authorities, as I understand it. That was a fairly recent announcement I saw you put on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about it last month, and recently the DFB have realised and accepted that the way that they've been coaching at youth level has not really been ideal. And it's the reason that a lot of controversy was surrounding the fact that Leroy Sané was admitted from the World Cup squad. I personally don't have a problem with him being admitted, because Julian Brandt was taken in his place, and I think Julian Brandt offers a lot of positives. But there's a certain level of Premier League bias in the way that Sané's admission was covered. Obviously, with players playing in the Premier League, they're obviously the greatest thing, slow spread. So it's always difficult. But I think Sané's admission was also slightly intriguing, because he is such an individual player who is capable of doing something that not many players in Germany who are German are capable of doing, and that is beating players in one-on-one situations and having that something special, basically, doing something special in a special situation. And that's why I think moving forward, he will ironically be probably the most important player in the Germany team, along with Serge Gnabry, because they're two examples of players who are really capable of doing something special in a one-on-one situation. And the reason that that's important comes all the way down to youth level. And I was at a coaching conference where I heard Professor Matthias Lochmann talk about this. And it's basically his idea that he has continued from Horst Wein, who was the original creator of this years and years ago. And it's this idea called Faninho, which is basically to radically change the way that young people at a youth level, I would say sort of under 7, 8, 9s. The specifics are in the book, but also online and in the article that I recently posted about the updates, where you stop kids playing full-size games. Basically, you stop them playing. You basically see them play in 2 teams of 3, where they try and attack and defend 2 goals. The goals are about 2 meters by 1 meter on a much smaller pitch. So theoretically, you could put 8 of these pitches on one full-size pitch. The reason for doing this is quite clear, and it sort of blew my mind when I first heard him talk about it. At the moment, if you think about the way that young football is being structured, and I think this also applies to England, because I'm quite concerned about the way that young kids are being taken into academies in England with this professionalisation from such a young age. I'm really struggling with that because you sell the wrong idea to kids. These kids are so desperate to be professional footballers, and at the age of 8, you're already giving them the full tracksuit and the team photo, and you're making them feel like they're already on 10 grand a week and that they're, Raheem Sterling in the making. And that's very problematic because you're selling the false dream, because not every single one of those kids can be a professional footballer. It's just the way that it's going to be. And actually you remove the fun out of the experience of the child. And if we're taking fun away from children, there's an extremely dangerous road to go down. So what you should do, and I think this is what Matthias is putting forward in such a brilliant way, is return the fun. So if you take away the current format of the game, which really is problematic because the pitches are too big, and the goals are too big and the games are too long, and as a player you rarely touch the ball and you're playing in positions that you're not really familiar with. And I'm sure anyone who's played football can remember when they were 7 or 8, you spent a lot of time running after the ball. I don't know how many touches you really had. You probably didn't score that many goals unless you're playing up front. It's not a particularly enjoyable experience. But what Fanino does, and it's, because it's 3-on-3 and there are 4 goals you're trying to defend 2 and you're trying to score in 2, and you can only score outside a certain area, you get way more touches. Everybody gets an opportunity to be far more involved in the game. There are 3 balls waiting for you on the sideline, so once a goal is scored, you just restart from there. And if there's, you don't play in league competitions, so that there's no coach bias here. There's no need for the coach to do well, so you can say, yeah, I got my under-9s promoted, and look how brilliant I am. The focus is on the kids, and the kids are able to have fun. You take the coaching side out of it in terms of their ego, and you put the coaching side in by giving these kids the chance to have more touches. They get more involved in the game. They have a much better understanding of space because the pitch is smaller. You don't need to worry about defending so much. It's more about movement and understanding how people move around you. There's always a sub, and whenever you score, I think one of your players comes off, and so there's a continuous rotation, which means that there are not players who are literally coming on a Saturday and sitting and spending 45 minutes on a bench, which would be the case in a normal game. And what you do, and there are lots more details, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about them because you just get bogged down in them. But basically, what you do is you just create far more fun, and pivotally, you give the children the opportunity to do what every child wants to do at that age, and that is score goals. And really, if we can all remember how young we were and how much we loved the sport back then before it became more serious, if you do that on a subliminal level, you are already improving their technical ability, and you are, coming full circle in the conversation, creating more Leroy Sané's, because you are creating players who are much more confident in one-on-one situations because you force them to be in a format that is predominantly focused on fun. So what Matthias Lochmann has put forward is great, and it's great to see that the DFB is rolling out the next stage of their pilot, and they pretty much accepted most of his suggestions, is that this is going to start to be tested on a county basis now, particularly in Bayern, in Bavaria, where they've been doing it for a while. And really, he said something really important, and I thought this was sort of really telling, is the problem is that, you need to stop saying, oh, well, we're all world champions, we've won the World Cup now. It's not really about whether Germany will win the World Cup, because if that's your focus, then that's the problem. It's about how many 10-year-olds can we get in Germany to be fully involved in enjoying football? Because if you do that, you create a much larger potential foundation, a basis of players that eventually are going to make their way up the hurdles, as it were, through the game, and stand a much better chance of doing well in a professional setting, or when they finally do play on a big pitch, and when they do play in a full-size game with 11 on 11. I think that's a much better way to approach it. There'll be people who criticize the fact that there's no goalkeeper coaching because there's no goalies. Yeah, well, there's a separate set of coaching for that. And obviously, there are ways to accommodate it. It's not that there's one fixed format of Fanino. There are lots of different ways to go around it. But you're effectively equipping kids with the skills that they need to play at the absolute next level. And if you do that, then the talent pool is bigger. And if you do that, then the likelihood of more players ending up at the elite level is much higher. So it's a system I totally, was totally in love with when I heard him talk about it. And I'm delighted that it's being implemented. And it has been for a while at some club levels. And there's just so many positives, really. Returning the fun to the game for the kids is the biggest thing for me. Really makes such a difference.
It really resonated with me on a lot of different levels. Not least of which, as a field hockey coach, Horst Ryan was a field hockey coach.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And it's ironic that hasn't really been taken up. Fournier hasn't really been taken up in hockey.
Yeah, strange.
We're playing. I mean, I've been advocating for quite a while. We do have a format in field hockey over here in England, which is called Quick Sticks, which is a 4v4 goal game. Similar idea.
Oh, okay.
But tradition dictates, and 8-year-olds play on a quarter pitch, going across the pitch in full size goals, and they play 7-a-side. And what happens is there's 14 players, and there's sticks flying in at a ball, and then the ball pops out, and then somebody runs away and scores, and that happens for about 7 minutes. There's not a lot of ball touches.
Yeah.
So I've been advocating something similar to Fournier, and I definitely and do it a lot in kind of the sort of the training games that we play. One of the things I really like about it, and what it really spoke to me about, was how in Germany they've sort of, seems to me anyway, they've embraced a more kind of games-based approach, which has been quite popular in different parts of the world, and certainly the FA and a number of the other major sports have, including GB hockey, have definitely embraced a more game-based approach. Actually, looking at, well, let's create a game form where the learning is taking place because of the game form, because the game form is designed to allow. So you don't have to go, right, here's training where you're going to get loads of touches of the ball. Here's a game where you're not going to get as many touches of the ball. It's like, well, actually, let's just do the training. Let's make the game a bit like what we might do in training, so that it's actually a better experience. And also allowing the development to happen naturally and more organically. So it's sort of allowing the skills to emerge because the game form demands it of the athletes, as opposed to, for example, my little boy's just started playing football last year. He's playing 9v9 and he's 10. And, 9v9 on these pitches, some of the goalies can't kick the ball far enough.
Exactly.
And they can be pressed. So actually the game isn't a particularly good game. There's hardly any... And
doesn't benefit anyone.
Exactly. Well, he learned quite quickly, because he wasn't particularly technically adept, because he only just started playing, that actually the best way for him to perform was to tackle. So he's like the tackle monster in the game, because he gets praised for tackling, and he's prepared to do so. So he gets stuck in, he tackles, and everyone goes, great. But that's kind of his main job now. So he's not really developing any technical capability.
He's just a tackler.
Although I'm being a bit unfair. He is developing, and he has developed quite a lot. It's with no input from me, clearly, because what do I know? But anyway, what's fascinating is, this podcast in particular is very, very committed to the idea that if we can create the right kind of environment for a young person that's based on their developmental needs, but most importantly, based on their engagement and fun and enjoyment and opportunities to express without adults coming in telling them what to do all the time.
Exactly.
And not only, like you say, and I'm so glad you said this, yes, not only are we going to get them really excited and enthused and wanting to have, kind of a lifelong affiliation with that activity, but they actually get better as well.
Yeah, they do. And that's the beauty of it. And I think that, you talk about games there. That's one of the best things about it. The idea would be that there would just be tournaments, that you would turn up and you would go to a certain city and then you play tournaments in that day, and that would be it. And if you take away the league structure, then you also take away this obsession and focus with winning, and as you say, this division between training and matches. And so, if we can return the fun in a way that effectively also creates an environment in which they will come out of it with a greater skill set than before, then it seems to me that there's almost no downside to it, because that's the best way to do it. And, if you can have a coaching situation where once you've explained the game, you almost don't need to do anything. So you're no longer interjecting as a coach or constantly saying, okay, guys, we need to do this again, or can we set the back four up again? Or, and at a younger level, it's so important, I think, to let these children just play, just discover, dribble more, score goals, celebrate those moments, get used to being in space and moving around. And the interesting thing is, you can do this drill with 12-year-olds. You can do this drill with 15-year-olds. And I saw it in practice. Even 14-year-olds from academies, they sometimes struggle with that drill.
Yeah.
And that's what the beauty of it. There's so many different forms of it that you can apply with goalies, not with goalies, slightly bigger, slightly smaller, fewer goals, more touches. But the base foundation of this drill is built around having kids just enjoy the game. And ironically, if you let them do that for a few years, by the time they're ready to play on a bigger skill set, they will be so technically sound in terms of having confidence on the ball, much better control. And also they'll just enjoy football more. And I think, there's a real danger, as I was talking about earlier, of pushing kids into this environment of, you're in a professional academy now. You play for Manchester City, for example. You got the tracksuit and you're in the under. Here's the photo, and you've got a big busy schedule. And if you don't play well enough, you're out. And there's no guarantee. And the pressure that also puts on parents. And how do you handle that with your children? How are you supposed to tell an 8-year-old, I don't know what to say. They're so desperate to become a professional footballer. They don't play every Saturday. They're coming home to you and they're like, Dad, I just want to play. I just want to have that opportunity. Why doesn't the coach pick me? And the coach is just there so that he can make sure that he wins and he does well and it looks good on his CV. This is just an example. But that's not helping anybody, and that's what I think is so wonderful about this approach. And it's ironic that it took a dramatic failing on the biggest stage for Germany, and by that obviously I mean Russia last year, for them to make this change at youth level. Because, Matthias has been advocating for this for a number of years. And it's amazing that a project that started, I think it was 2012, when he first did it in his town, in a local town with 56 kids, is now being rolled out on a national basis. It's credit to him for pursuing it and believing in it. But it's perhaps a bit of a shame that it took Germany's Federal Association, Football Association, so long to recognize the error of their youth coaching, and that it was because of a first team error on the biggest stage that they decided to make changes. I mean, I'm glad the changes have been made, but there's a case to be made that they should have been introduced earlier.
It's often the way, isn't it? They say that necessity is the mother of invention.
Yes,
and also that often, in order to create the kind of catalyst for change, you need some kind of catastrophic failure in order to bring about. And often it's a shame, because you'd hope that people might have the foresight, but too often I think in these kinds of environments, kind of particularly on national level, there's this whole idea of it's not broke. If it's not broken, don't fix it.
Germany really suffered from that. They really suffered from that on a national scale. The worst thing they did was 2014, they won the World Cup and they thought that was it. They did not make the changes. And I go into detail about this in the book, and I am pretty ruthless and I'm pretty blunt, but that's because I was fortunate enough to be around them during the 2018 competition, and I've watched them for a number of years. I just was so frustrated. They kept saying one thing, we're at the peak, we're here, we're the blueprint, we're the best, and they did nothing. And true quality, the best teams in the world, teams like the All Blacks, when they reach the top, they do not even acknowledge it. They are so far from recognizing they are at the top that they are already focusing on how to stay there. And Germany did not do that and paid the price. And, now they've got to start again.
Because everybody else is going to try and catch up, aren't they? Everyone's going to do their level best to overcome, and they'll look at, okay, what can we see that they've done there, right? We're going to emulate that and all that sort of stuff, and probably we could go on, but it's a really good, it's a good lesson though in many ways, isn't it? Around kind of innovative developmental cultures, whether they are academies, whether they are national associations, or whether it's just a little club or it's just a coach working with a group of players. This idea that once we've achieved a goal, that's kind of it, we'll just carry on. It just doesn't work that way. We're always looking to strive to find that little moment of improvement, that little Vorsprung, the edge.
Yes.
See, I definitely, it's gone in. It's definitely gone in.
It's all coming back to it.
Jonathan, listen, I'm going to be mindful of your time. And as fascinating as the conversation's been, I highly recommend anybody to go out and get it. There's genuinely some, there's a load of insights. I'm going to say it's a two-reader for me. Because I've had to go back, and yes, there's that. Oh yeah, because I read it once and it's a bit of I went through it quite quickly, and then I'm like, oh no, I've got to get back into that because there's some real good detail in there that I want to be able to pull out. So highly recommend it to anybody. If people are interested in maybe I don't know, reaching out to you or getting in touch, or maybe they want you to come and speak at a conference, it often happens. How can they get in touch? What's the best way?
The best way, I'm on Twitter most of the time, JohnBlog66. So yeah, feel free to drop me a line on there. If you want to email me, then jrj.harding@gmail.com. But yeah, I mean, please feel free to get in touch, and just really grateful for the opportunity to share the insights of the coaches I've spoken to, and to be able to talk about this with someone who's so qualified and so smart. So I appreciate it.
Well, I always say the podcast is only as good as the guest, so thank you for contributing to this one. I wish you all the best, and I hope the book goes fantastically well, because it's a really useful and fascinating insight into, in my opinion, where coaching needs to go more, and I think it really adds to, and it's going to really support many of the messages that a lot of us in the community have been trying to advocate for some time.
Well, I really appreciate that, Stuart. Thank you very much. I hope it goes well as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
So there you have it. Fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really interesting conversation, and actually thanks so much for writing the book. Really found it absolutely fascinating, as I said in the podcast. 3 takeaways from me to share with everybody. The starting point is the title, Mensch, a human catcher. Not a human catcher in terms of some sort of pantomime villain, but the idea of being able to capture another individual, another person, and be able to, kind of work and engage them in that way. That idea of engagement is so key, and I think the idea of working in that way, I really like that term. The other one for me is this conceptualization around, Generation Y, and working with different generations and being prepared to engage with them and explain why we're involved in certain exercises, rather than them just following blindly along with the instructions that we provide or the activities that we provide. And then obviously there's lots of stuff around the transformation that's happening within German football, focusing much more into a kind of a games-based model, if you like, which is obviously of real interest to me. But I just a quote that really I wrote down that I think is worth sharing with everybody, this idea of the fire you want to light in others must burn inside you. That just really resonated with me, actually, because I thought to myself, yeah, that's definitely something that I need to hold close in terms of making sure that my passion and my engagement really translates onto the players. An obvious thing, really, but sometimes you need to be reminded of the obvious things. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. I certainly did. Lots to take away. I'll be discussing the book actually with some members of the conclave over the coming months. The conclave is a group of individuals, like-minded individuals, who want to come together to learn from each other, and I facilitate and prompt it. If you want to get involved, then the way to do that is to become a Patreon supporter. There's a particular level that you can do that, and you can join in. Now, if you can't join a conclave, that's fine, not a problem, but any support that you can provide will be really greatly appreciated, because it helps keep the podcast running, because the costs seem to increase with changes to bandwidth and hosting costs and all those sorts of things. So I'd be appreciative. You can become a supporter for the price of a cup of coffee, or even 2 cups of coffee, or you can get involved in the conclave and then become an active learner as well. Entirely up to you, but it'd be great to have you on board and be part of the community. In the meantime, have a great week of coaching, and remember, ditch those drills